I think what's going to win is either Solana, because the ecosystem is good at executing and is ahead of all these problems, or something that looks exactly like Solana is. And the only reason that it's not Solana is because they executed faster.
This episode is brought to you by Ledger, the most secure hardware wallet trusted by 7 million users and securing 20% of the world's digital assets. Thank you to Ledger for making this episode possible. If you like the Lightspeed podcast, then you need to subscribe to the Lightspeed newsletter, written by a team including yours truly and delivered to your email inbox daily. Lightspeed is your essential...
And in fact, not only is MEV through the roof, Jito tips have surpassed Solana priority fees in many cases. What do you think about this? Why is this the case? Why is it acceptable?
So you can set up your own validator and you can submit your own transactions without anyone's interference, right?
Kind of.
And you can't do that in traditional markets. Mm-hmm. You simply don't have that option. So that was the democratizing function. That piece works. Now the question is, it's hard to set up a validator. It's hard to scale it to enough stake where that's substantial. It's hard to find other peers that will order transactions the way you want them to, and whatever you call fair, whatever. But you can do it. It's just takes time and effort, and the markets themselves are not mature enough to where this is created competition between Jito and whoever's competing with them and everyone else, to where users can then easily pick, I'm only submitting to order flow creator Y versus order flow creator K. So the functionality, kind of the fundamental principles of me as a hobbyist, I could spin up my own validator, get some stake, and then run my algos and submit my own transactions directly into the markets without anyone. That all exists. No one can stop you from doing that. Now the question is, are we at a place where this has matured to where the users always see the best possible way to submit transactions? I think we're far from that. But my view is that the way to get there is the dumb way, which is also the hard way, is increase bandwidth, reduce latency, optimize the hell out of the network to eliminate all those bottlenecks where things become unfair. And that includes, multiple concurrent leaders and stuff like that. So fundamentally, right, if you have only one leader per slot and you get 1% of the stake, you roughly get 1 in 100 slots. But if you have 2 leaders per slot with 1% of the stake, you get 1 of every 50 slots, right? So the more liters per second we can add, the less stake you need to be able to run your algorithm at the quality of service that you need. Currently,
The way it works is you need to amass some amount of stake to be able to prioritize your transactions. And even if that weren't the case, it seems like having more stake in the system is just going to be useful for perhaps having your own block space and all this. And so there's some dynamic here where the richer you are, the more of an advantage you have.
Right. And
is that acceptable?
Performance improvements reduce the barrier to entry for honest participants to change the market dynamics. So if we have 2 liters per second and now it takes half the amount of stake for me to offer the same kind of service as before, and therefore it takes less, there's a lower economic barrier to entry to be able to compete and say, hey, I'm the best validator. You should always submit all your Jupiter transactions to me. I'm going to do the thing that you want. Right? So I can then run a business, offer it to users, and then competition will force the market to be at the most fair equilibrium. That's the ultimate goal. But to get there, I think the very different thing about Solana versus Ethereum is I absolutely believe it's just an engineering problem. We just need to optimize the network, increase bandwidth in terms of the number of liters per second, in terms of blocks, the block sizes, just everything. Just grow everything until competition forces the markets to be in their optimal spot.
Talking about engineering problems, one of the reasons why Jito tips have surpassed priority fees is not just MEV, but because landing transactions, or maybe more accurately, the fee markets that we say are local fee markets, don't work deterministically and sometimes don't work that well at all. What's up with that?
Again, this is because of the implementation that actually processes all those transactions are far from optimal and under extremely high load. Like if the load is low, everything works great. We had like during the mini bear that we had over the last 6 months, there was a time where I was seeing sub 1 second end-to-end confirmations. Everything was functioning smoothly there because the number of proposed transactions submitted to the leader were so small that those queues, the quick connection table, all this other shit was not being filled up to the point where performance bottlenecks were causing those queues to back up. And when those queues back up, you can't do prioritization in those queues until you get to the scheduler. And that effectively breaks down the local fee market. So again, in my mind, this is a engineering problem that probably is the most ecosystem engineering investment right now out of anything else. It's just optimizing the hell out of those pipelines.
Given that these problems exist, and it seems like your answer to them is that, well, they exist, but they're an engineering problem, and so they're solvable, and hence they will be solved with further iterations. And somebody might say to that, well, these problems don't really exist on L2s due to their architecture, right? Like you can't, I mean, you have a centralized sequencer, you can do first come, first serve. And
first come, first serve will lead to the exact same problems. So even Arbitrum has like a priority lane. So if you have first come, first serve, you encourage spam. It's the same issue. So if you have a generalized L2 that has multiple applications, it'll end up in the same problems. Now, one can argue that because they don't have also consensus and everything else vertically integrated, that can iterate much faster and just make releases like a Web2 company, like every 4 to 8 hours, just push a new binary on their centralized sequencer and fix it faster. They still have the exact same problems as Solana. And you can argue that Jito effectively has that opportunity to do now because of their relayers can be updated every 24 hours, or they can release them all the time anyways. What they're not doing right now is they're not scheduling and filtering enough of the data to where the output stream from those relayers is capped at a capacity that the validator scheduler can handle no matter what. But you can kind of get the same effect. So like, I don't think L2s on their own fix these problems. They fix them only when you launch an L2 and there's only one app that's popular there and no other applications. And that's not even true about an app itself. Like if you have an app with multiple markets, you'll have market A will cause so much congestion that all the other markets are impacted.
Well, let's take the other side of that, where it's not a general purpose L2, but something like Atlas, which is a DeFi specific chain, and it runs the SVM. How does Solana compete with something like that, where they don't have to worry about the overhead of consensus and a bunch of other things, or shared block space, but they could just optimize for DeFi, and with the SVM, they can also add fee markets?
What you're talking about is just how does Solana compete with Solana with a smaller validator set? In that case, it's one, right? So it's simpler to optimize. You can throw a bigger box at it. This is the fundamental question: is does synchronous composability matter at scale? And this one smaller network can only cover that tiny portion of the world where that box exists. So information still has to propagate all around the world to that box. In the end state of Solana, you have multiple validators that can submit transactions all at the same time, all globally, and it's a permissionless open set. And if you solve for that, you end up with Solana. It doesn't matter if it's submitting data to the L2, but the really hard question is, how do I submit and propagate information everywhere in the world at once and agree on it as fast as possible? As soon as you start working on that problem, that's no longer localized to one machine in New York or Singapore or whatever, you need to have some semblance of consensus and consistency and linearization. You will deal with the exact same problems as Solana does, even if later you rely on an L2 to get more like harder settlement guarantees. So in my view, like these single box SVMs are basically no different than Binance. How do we compete with Binance? Like, this is a more interesting question. Like, if you could, you could use this single box SVM L2, or you could use Binance. And to a user, at the end of the day, Binance is a better experience. So like, we need to be able to be the best version of the centralized exchange. And I think the only way to get there is to embrace this idea of decentralized multi-proposer architecture.
The other advantage is that Solana has to do this anyways, and with an L2, they can kind of solve some of these problems faster, right? It's easier to solve problems on a single box than 1,500 boxes. And so in the case that they get more traction right out the gate and start amassing network effects, Solana has all these problems regardless of what they do. And so since they run the same architecture, they can just learn from that and perhaps ship it faster. And so how do you compete on a business level?
Question is, can those single boxes survive when they hit like it's not like if you put up a single box, just all of a sudden solve everything. You're going to have almost the exact same engineering challenges, especially if you look at like how that like part of the, like, no one is talking about like, oh, Solana's consensus overhead. What they're talking about is the transaction submission pipeline, right? And that in piece itself can be centralized on Solana, just like it is on an L2. In fact, Jito is effectively that. They have a single box relayer. It gets slammed with a whole bunch of transactions and then tries to submit it to the validator. That data rate between the relayer and the validator can be capped to a rate that is so small that the validator will always succeed. And then that Jito side can iterate much, much faster. So that advantage, I think, is smaller than people realize of an L2.
The other side of this, if we expand the scope a little bit, is Solana as an L1 is shared block space. And so you face tragedy of the commons, shitting in the public pool type of problems, versus on an L2, or it doesn't have to be an L2, it can be an app chain, you have your own block space, you don't have to share with anybody. And for the app dev, that might be more attractive.
Only if it's permissioned. It has to be a permissioned environment.
Why is that?
As soon as you have permissionless validators, you don't have that control, right? Or permissionless sequencer. As soon as you have multiple applications, it's no longer shared. Even in a single app like Uniswap, if you have multiple markets, the markets are going to interfere with each other. Like the order priority for random ass meme coin is going to interfere with the major markets. So if you think of it as a product, like imagine we're in the wonderful future where everything's tokenized and I'm deciding where to deploy my IPO company that is just, become a unicorn. And I look at Uniswap and I see that SHIB number 5 causes so much congestion that people can't trade the majors. That's a failure state for that app specific L2. So they have the exact same challenges as Solana. They have to isolate each separate piece of state in a way that it doesn't impact everyone else. Because even if it's just Uniswap running in a single box in TEEs, if a single market impacts everything else, causes congestion across all the other markets, me as somebody that is like the IPO CEO, I'm not going to want to have like that be my major market, the one that everyone trades on. I want isolation just for my own pair.
What if it is permissioned? Isn't it okay that they're permissioned since they have exit hatches?
Even if it's permission, they have to still solve that local isolation problem. And that isolation problem, solving it in that permission environment is no different than solving it in the Jito relayer or the scheduler, that whole pipeline in Solana.
Do you think this market analogy can be mapped to any type of application?
There's some applications that don't have those properties where it's just peer-to-peer payments and there's simply no congestion, that it's trivial to schedule. So the challenge that why you even designed isolation and all of these stupid things, why even bother doing all of this, is that if you cannot guarantee that a single market or a single app or whatever causes congestion globally, then somebody like Visa will launch their own payment specific L2 because their transactions just never have any contention. They don't care about prioritization because what they care about is just TPS, just give me raw TPS and make sure the P90 confirmation time is below X. But I don't really care at the cash register if I'm first in the block or last. All I care about is that when I swipe my card in 2.5 seconds, I can leave. Right? So that there's no prioritization scheme there that is really important to payments. And that is a very major use case. It's not like a theoretical use case. And my belief is that if we can't if we can't implement isolation correctly, the whole idea of giant composable state machine is moot, because you will have payments chains, you will even have single market L2s. Me as the IPO person in 20 years, why would I even launch on Uniswap chain? Why wouldn't I launch my own L2 with just my own pair to guarantee good performance, right? So that is a future that's possible, but I think there's no engineering reason why that is going to happen. It would have to be for other reasons altogether. And if we solve the engineering problems, then I think there's a huge advantage from composability being in a single environment where the friction to move money between all the states and all the liquidity is effectively atomically shared. And that's a really, really important property. In my mind, I think the reason why Solana DeFi survived the depth of the bear that hit Solana worse than anyone else is because it was composable and it was much more capital efficient because of that.
As anyone doing stuff on-chain knows, security for your crypto is super important. That's the benefit you get from Ledger, which has been around for a decade now and is the most secure hardware wallet for your Solana and logins. Ledger's newest devices, Ledger Stacks and Ledger Flex, have secure touchscreens, making it easier to manage your crypto. And with Ledger Live, you can seamlessly and securely manage and stake your Solana. Alongside Ledger Stacks and Ledger Flex, Ledger introduced the Ledger Security Key app, a safer alternative to traditional passwords, enhancing your overall digital security. Thank you, Ledger, for sponsoring this episode.
Vitalik recently, I don't know how recent, but he basically commented that, in my view, synchronous composability is overrated. And I think he's probably referring to the empirical evidence that we haven't seen too much of it being utilized on chain. What do you think about that?
I mean, what is Jupiter if not synchronous composability? I think he's only looking at Ethereum, unfortunately. Jupiter has enormous market share in Solana, and its market share is enormous in the entire crypto space.
It is that to synchronous composability.
But you cannot build Jupiter without synchronous composability. It just doesn't work. You look at 1inch, which is the Ethereum competitor, and they cannot scale because the cost to move even between L2s and the same L1 is so astronomically expensive and slow. Yeah, I think he's wrong. I think you can have finance that's asynchronous, and that's how most finance works today. And it's not like those systems will die or something, but I think if Solana succeeds and we, like the ecosystem solves all these problems at the current pace as they're solving them, even if it just continue, like everyone just continues to execute as well as they are, and year after year you can see a dramatic improvement. I think at the end of the day, synchronous composability is going to be the winner.
Let's put aside the engineering problems, and let's assume that engineering is not a moat, and that other chains can achieve the same outcomes. Let's say something like SWI, they can have atomic composability, synchronous composability, and they can just have a smaller validator size set. And let's say some of these L2s, I mean, they'll face the same problems, like you said, but they can also solve them. And so I've asked you in the past, what happens, what's the moat when engineering is not a moat? And you said content and features.
Yes, Solana doesn't have a specific validator target. The reason why the testnet is at 3,500 validators, or mainnet is as large as it is because I want it to be as large as possible, simply because it's future-proofing the network. If you want to have as many block producers in the world as you can, you just need to have a large validator set. You want to allow anyone to be able to enter and participate in every part of the network permissionlessly. You should be eating your dog food and running it at the highest rate possible, because right now, solving these problems is cheap. Solana isn't trading, $1 trillion of users 401k so, in the United States, which is what Main Street does, like Wall Street does. It's meme coins, which is great, but that's an opportunity to throw the best minds in the world at these hard problems and force them to go deal with them. So my view is that it's more likely that SUI and Aptos will need to do work to increase their validator set than the other way. Then Solana will be we better lower validator set for performance improvements. Simply because if you hit PMF, everyone wants to run their own box because you get guarantees. And as that validator set grows, if you start restricting people, it's going to limit how much you can grow.
So actually, okay, good you mentioned that, because one thing I want to talk about is, while that is the goal, if you look at the data, the number of validators over time has decreased. And it seems like you're kind of attributing that to a lack.
Kyrgyz. Or whatever the name.
PMF, and so they don't have an incentive to run their own boxes. Is that right, or what's the reason there?
Yeah, well, you have some of the Solana Foundation stake will distort that. I'd be actually interested to see what's the number of validators that are self-sustaining. Is that set growing?
We have that. One sec.
Year over year.
On this. 420 validators would be self-sufficient.
But what was that 2 years ago?
I don't think we have that, but we do have that the total stake from Solana Foundation has decreased by quite a bit since 2 years ago.
And fees have increased, so I guess the self-sustaining number is much smaller 2 years ago. even if the overall set was larger. So that would be my guess. Like, so my view is that like we need the network to like be able to scale up to support everyone that wants to run a box. So that's the whole purpose of like the delegation program, is to like get as many hobbyists or whoever to run it and just like stress it a little more. And do that in the testnet. But testnet can never simulate mainnet characteristics, right? Like it's just, no matter how many invalidator tests they throw at it, there's always like just mainnet is so much different. So as long as that number's growing, the self-sustaining number, to me that is like the positive trend to look at. And the network physically has to be able to scale to support up to whatever that number is. Otherwise, you start limiting growth.
So basically what you're saying is the delegation helps with stress testing a network to like different validator set sizes, but fundamentally the only thing that matters, or the main thing that matters, is the self-sustaining ones. Is that right?
There's some argument you can make about like the theoretical argument that a single box, it doesn't matter if it's not a self-sustaining box. In theory, in a catastrophic failure, if that's the only box that survives, that does help. But this is a like tail end nuclear war decentralization question. But from like fundamental, like, is the network growing and successful? What matters is self-sustaining validators that can pay their own bills and give a shit about the network to commercially keep improving it and digging through the data and doing all the stuff that they do,
So one of the other criticism that's related to this is Solana's inflation schedule, where you can argue that it's helping subsidize more validators by giving them more rewards. At the same time, this comes at the expense of, let's say, people who are, I don't know, let's say just purely investing. When people say that Solana's inflation is too high, what are your initial reactions? Like, how do you think about it?
Just read.
¿Aló? Hola. miro otras posibilidades. Tampoco es que yo haya dicho como que, que no está tan quería que me dijo que no hubiera conquista. Pero yo creo que eso es una posibilidad y pues sí, no sé verdad qué pensar.
Y ella te llama y te pregunta, Miguel, ¿tienes novia, Miguel? No sé qué, Miguel, o no.
No, de paso me preguntaba mucho, pero nunca lo llamó ni nada. Aunque esta última vez que vino me estuvo más querida que el pasado.
Y cuando te dijeron que sí ibas a ir y tú dijiste que no, ella estaba ahí, ¿o no?
No creo. De pronto sí, una vez, porque eso me dice que me invitan muchas veces. De, siempre me insisten. Entonces esta vez me preguntaron varias veces si yo no, no. En un momento estuve como medio a punto de ir, pero después dije no, y entonces como que no.
Pero lo hiciste más que todo por ella, no ir.
No, eso afectó, eso por un porcentaje sí, pero más que todo lo hice como por, justamente por lo que tú me acabas de decir, como por yo tratar de demostrar y ver que yo soy capaz también, yo no dependo de ellos, que me inviten, yo soy capaz de estar solo, también porque yo, no, el principal motivo es relacionado, pero el principal motivo es que tengo como muchas cosas aquí, como que tengo clases, tengo gimnasio, de pronto es la fiesta de los amigos que no hubo, pero de pronto iba a ver, están muchas cosas, entonces yo dije, pues para mí me conviene más estar aquí en Medellín tratando de ser una mejor persona que estar en Miami en una cama todo el día yendo a centros comerciales y comiendo y nada más.
Sí, también ir a Miami, o sea, en el caso tuyo sí, vacaciones.
Ajá.
Vacaciones es ir a romper la dieta, es ir, sí,
Y siempre que yo voy a vacaciones, cuando vuelvo, llego todo descuadrado, entonces paso por ahí 2 semanas que no hago ejercicio, como que mientras que vuelvo a comer rutina, entonces está eso más. Yo dijera, no me voy a semana y cuando vuelvas digo, pues, como que
a no ser que te fueras una semana y tuvieras la rutina de bajar al lobby y hacer ejercicio, no sé.
sí, pero yo he tratado, pero es difícil. La vez pasada traté de hacer eso, pero cierta persona me quita plata y cierta persona me intoxicó, entonces tuve que perder la rutina y llegué todo jodido.
Estuvo acá como 2 meses y acá vino 3 días, o sea, no se recuperó.
Sí, pero ya yo me lo sentí.
Porque eso es el corona, pero eso perder peso. Y masa muscular. Pues Miguel tiene la solución. Si no quieren ver casa, aquí tiene como quiere. No le insisto más, pero le digo la posibilidad.
Usted ya consiguió la ciudadanía.
No, ya. No, pues, yo me fallaste.
Sí, fue un poco de tropa en verdad.
Yo no sé, o sea, es que está, supuestamente me tenía que haber llegado en enero, febrero, y nada, y a Claudia Bustamante tampoco, entonces Claudia me llama y me dice, ¿usted ya le tengo? Y digo, no, nada, no, a mí tampoco, y el abogado suyo que le dijo, no, que todos los procesos están retrasados, o sea, están como sacando a la gente, o sea, están enfatizados en sacar a la gente que no cumple con los requisitos y los van despejando. Como que en eso tienen toda la concentración ahorita y el
vista.
Sí,
Sí, exacto. Y yo, pero la otra vez que he ido o que me quedo más tiempo ha sido justamente por eso. Y esta vez lo pensé mucho. O sea, cuando casi cambio de opinión era por eso. Tienes toda la razón.
sí, uno no puede decir, si la niña tiene 14, 15 años, no le pare bolas a lo que diga una niña, está en un proceso de inmadurez, o sea, debe ser una niña supremamente inmadura. No le pares bolas a eso, además está la chiquita, que tú sí le caes bien a la chiquita. Y a la chiquita con unos 10 años tampoco la vas a caer bien,
Exacto.
porque así es la gente, o sea, esa es la otra.
No,
Así
claro,
somos los humanos. Pero pues, un día de mañana serán las cosas distintas, cuando las niñas sean más grandes, cuando tengan sus propios hijos, todo el cuento, papi. Pero tus papás no van a estar con vida en mucho tiempo, entonces pues disfrútenlos. Son oportunidades, cada vez se van haciendo más viejos, cada vez se van a cansar más de viajar, y no, ese es tu tiempo con ellos.
Yo pienso lo mismo.
Mi hermana, sí. Y si te hacen mal acá, pues te vienes para acá.
A mí me gusta.
Aquí está Atlanta. O sea, acá tienes mi carro. Acá hay muchos planes para hacer también. Ya viste la ciudad que no es tan chiquita.
No, es una ciudad grande.
Aunque también para donde tengo que agarrar. O sea, no.
Una ciudad tiene el tamaño, eso fue el tamaño de la ciudad.
Sí, para ir al cantón es a 45 minutos.
No, en Estados Unidos, sí, no acá. Llegué a ir a Estados Unidos y a otro país.
La mamá de aquí tiene dos carritos, no son carritos, son
si ho chiesto io tutti i regali, io quando mi llegano il primo capitolo, yo bueno, vamos para el segundo. Y no había, y bajo un poco mucho.
Qué rabia la pasta. A mí me pasó eso con Chespirito. Me rabia. Esperaba que fuera no jueves. Después se me olvidó. Y entré y ya la luz ya se había acabado porque estaba todo la primera serie. No, no viste Chespirito.
No, mira bien.
Ahí está. Es bueno, pero eso nunca viste el Chavo, me imagino.
¿Por qué no?
¿Tú lo viste?
Obvio. Totalmente el chavo.
Vale, el Chavo. La gente latinoamericana.
Aunque me gustaba más Chapulín o Chapatín.
Es que ahí cuenta todo el proceso de todo. Muy interesante. Oye, el título del libro está triste.
Sí, yo creo que también leía. Qué rabia, qué rabia.
Quedó enorme el niño, al lado del amor y las florecitas y todo, y pensar que todas las flores se le van a caer toda su vida.
Qué dolor y la gente que permite eso, y el perdón de santos allá. O sea, esto es culpa de santos.
Que no fue la paz. Y el otro caso por caso.
Después de volver a cárcel el que me hizo algo.
Pero lo que decía Milei es que con la izquierda no se le puede dar ni un centímetro porque y a él le pasó eso, él que le empezó a meter en las listas al Congreso, gente, sí, él necesitaba guerreros en esas listas, él necesitaba gente, mejor dicho, arpías.
Él cometió ese error y sigue cometiendo. Y yo creo que es una lección muy fuerte que nos ha dado Milei. Cuando yo ya me la tengo muy metida en la cabeza, ni un centímetro de los frutos de mierda. Tiene toda la razón. Pues yo ya lo sabía desde antes, yo pensaba lo mismo, pero no como que se le olvida. Entonces, esa gente es así, no se les puede dar ni un centímetro.
Uno de ahora como quiere meter a Pinzón Bueno, que fue ministro de Santos, también creo que fue ministro de Uribe, no sé, pero no, o sea, Pinzón es un tipo muy decente, que no es para el momento que está viviendo el momento coyuntural que vive Colombia. Ese es decente, pues será para un pozo,
Pero es que
pero no
como
para el
nadie.
momento. A mí me parece que hablar de las críticas.
Tú eras el número uno, pero ya dejaste de salir también. No sé si por los datos, porque
Me parece que es un poco como el ego un poquito desbordado, uno,
también es como oportunista, yo creo, también es un poco oportunista.
todos son oportunistas, todo, pero sí me parece que eso no es tan, esto es la palabra.
Y también como el video de cuando apoyaba como a Petro, muy bien eso, que hablaba bien de Petro.
Yo también.
Sí, te encuentras con puntos.
Yo también tengo un poco de
Read John Carbonell's articles on this. Like, it's just like beating a dead horse. Like, moving numbers around a black box doesn't matter. That's it. You can move in a way that impacts people to the point that the black box dies, but in it itself doesn't create or destroy any value. It's just accounting. The reason why the inflation is the way it is because it was copied from Cosmos, because the initial set of validators were a bunch of Cosmos validators. But if you look at like fundamentally, does inflation matter to an individual who is in a specific tax regime? It might matter, but to the network as a whole, it is a cost to non-stakers and an equal gain to stakers, and those add up to zero. So that inflation mathematically from an accounting perspective doesn't matter to the network as a black box.
I've seen people say, if it is arbitrary, then why not reduce it?
Go for it. Post a SIMD. I personally don't care. Like, I've said this like a billion times. Change it to whatever you want. Go convince the validators to do it. Like, they like basically pick these numbers out of their own hat, right? Like, at the time, the major constraint of picking the numbers was that it's not going to be a total disaster to pick this specific thing. And since Cosmos didn't fail because of that, it was good enough.
In the end state, where everybody can run fast, cheap, permissionless systems, why should people pick Solana? How does Solana compete?
I think what's going to win is either Solana, because the ecosystem is good at executing and is ahead of all these problems, or something that looks exactly like Solana is. And the only reason that it's not Solana is because they executed faster to a point where they overcame the existing network effects that Solana mainnet already has. So this is where, like, I think
execution is the only moat.
Always. If you suck at execution, you'll get passed by somebody. Yep. But somebody else has to be so much better that it is like a PMF killer. And you can think of PMF, like product market fit, for those who don't know that, is like something that causes user behavior to switch. Like, why would I switch from Solana to something else? If transactions are 10 times cheaper, would a person switch? Well, not if the person's paying half a cent. But if a person's paying slippage, and slippage is 10 times lower somewhere else, that could be enough for them to switch, or enough for traders to switch. So you have to look at like the person's overall behavior, and is there an improvement that is so fundamentally better that would make him choose a different product. And between Solana and Ethereum, there was, because the fees to a user when they sign that transaction, it tells them that you're going to pay $30 to like accept this ERC20 in your wallet. Not even just to do anything, just even do a very, very simple basic state change. That was so astronomically out of band to what users wanted to pay that the price difference was enough to get behaviors to change. And then the other one was time, right? You can't wait 2 minutes for a confirmation. It's just too long. So Solana is at like 2 seconds right now at P50, but sometimes goes up to as much as 8 seconds, but is going from 8 to 400 milliseconds, such a massive behavior change for a user that they're willing to switch products. That's an unknown. But nothing in engineering in Solana precludes the network to get the same optimizations to improve both latency and throughput. So this is like, I think, why people ask, oh, if Solana is like growing faster than Ethereum, somebody else is going to come next. That marginal difference between Solana and the next thing is much, much smaller. It's much harder for that to be a behavior change difference. So that's kind of like to improve both latency and throughput. So this is like, I think, dollars to like accept this ERC20 in your wallet. Not even just to do anything, just even do a very, very simple basic state change. That was so astronomically out of band to what users wanted to pay that the price difference was enough to get behaviors to change. And then the other one was time, right? You can't wait 2 minutes for a confirmation. It's just too long. So Solana is at like 2 seconds right now at P50, but sometimes goes up to as much as 8 seconds, but is going from 8 to 400 milliseconds, such a massive behavior change for a user that they're willing to switch products. That's an unknown. But nothing in engineering in Solana precludes the network to get the same optimizations to improve both latency and throughput. So this is like, I think, why people ask, oh, if Solana is like growing faster than Ethereum, somebody else is going to come next. That marginal difference between Solana and the next thing is much, much smaller. It's much harder for that to be a behavior change difference. So that's kind of like the challenge.
So if execution is the moat, the main one, then fundamentally it becomes a challenge of organization to some extent, or coordination. And one of the differences between Solana's vision and, let's say, modular, even though that's not a real term, is on Solana, let's say you're an app like Drip, and you built your application there. You need to wait for the L1 to make certain changes for, let's say, congestion bug fixes or something like that. Versus on an L2, if it's an app chain, you can just do that yourself. And so maybe there's an argument there where you can execute faster on this other chain than on a shared space. And so if that's true, then you can execute faster overall. And if execution is the only moat,
year over year, that becomes smaller and smaller of a delta, right? Like Ethereum was so slow that if you were Drip on Ethereum and fees went up to $50, you're like, well, let me go ask Vitalik when this is going to be fixed. And he's like, well, we have a 6-year roadmap, bro. Like, it's going to take a while. And when you at least ask like Firedancer or Agave folks or anyone, they're like, there's already a team trying to fix this with the next release as fast as possible. So there's that difference, is that culturally the core L1 and you guys too, like the entire infrastructure kind of around submitting transactions, everyone understands that when things are slow or there's global congestion, that's like a P0 fire that everyone needs to fix. There's times when you need to, like, when you get really smacked in the face and you're like, oh fuck, we need a design change, like the fee market one. But those become further and further, like less and less likely as the network just simply grows from usage. So I don't know if there is one of those like critical, we need to fix a design thing that's going to take 6 months to a year to deploy. I don't see one right now. Like there isn't like kind of something like that on the horizon, but you're definitely going to run into like release bugs or whatever else like that's unforeseen. That'll need like people working over the weekend. That's part of life. And if you have your own app specific L2 that's not shared and you own that entire infra stack, you can probably move faster, but that's expensive. Not everyone can afford that. So the shared infra layer that's composable, that everyone can share and use, for the vast majority of use cases is probably going to be cheaper and faster as a software layer, as a service stack. And as it fixes bugs and kind of keeps improving, that delta becomes smaller and smaller.
So let's go to the other coordination, let's say.
Después vienen los años.
a challenge. We've been hyping up Firedancer, and Jerry recently came out and said, well, I mean, some people actually now think it's overrated, but Jerry also said it's slowing people down. Anza engineers and Firedancer engineers obviously have to agree on certain things and ship from there. And so it does slow things down initially. And it seems like your argument is that once the specs and interfaces are clean, then you can actually iterate faster. Is that really?
Yeah. So like, there's like three steps. One is the design step. You got to agree on what you're going to do. Then implementation, and then testing and verifying that it doesn't cause a safety or liveness bug. And my feeling is that the design step will take longer. Implementation is parallelized, so both teams can do it at the same time. But the testing, auditing phase should be much faster because the probability of two independent teams shipping the same bug is smaller. The big difference, I think, is that I think Ethereum runs in this like, we're going to have one major release and it's going to land with all these features that are targeted for this release. And what they're picking is the feature set and not the release date. The way that Solana's always functioned is kind of almost the opposite, is there's a release date. If your feature doesn't make it, it gets cut. And those releases are just much, much faster. So in theory, like the iteration cycle could even speed up with two teams that want to speed it up. Like that's got to come from the core engineers, and they kind of have to have that fire in them. Like, hey, we need to release the stuff as fast as reasonable, and kind of rely on this implementation like redundancy. I think culturally both teams kind of have that background because they're not academic. They're all their life they've been under the pressure cooker of tech.
Mm-hmm. And so that brings me to the third point of coordination and execution, which is that you must assume that you have zero executional capability because you're working on a phone instead of helping the L1 ship or helping these client teams coordinate. Is that really the right play?
For me personally, like the last big changes that I've kind of been involved with was like getting the accounts DB index out of RAM, and I could write up a design and a like little implementation that proves that it could work. But the problem is that to land it, you need a full-time engineer that is specific on that task. And I can hand it off to Jaywash, and then he landed it, right? And the testing and the release cycle, all that stuff takes a year. Me as a single IC, it would be awesome. I would love to just be an IC at Anza or Firedancer, just like staring at Grafana and building stuff. It's just I'm split across like a bajillion different efforts. So the place that I found to have the highest impact is like I can define the problem, state growth, or like the multiple concurrent leader problem, like the censorship problem there, like the MEV competition problem. And I can propose a solution, and I can talk to everyone, and they all agree, okay, your analysis of the problem is right, and here's like maybe how I would do it. And we all iterate on that design, and eventually it gets kind of gelled and solidified. And then as that fire that I've anticipated starts kind of getting hotter and hotter, people already have the design. We've already done the hard part, which is the agreement part between two teams, and then it's just implementation and testing. So my role is almost like principal engineer at a big company. You don't write any code. You go talk to a bunch of teams, and you're like, hey, I noticed you're struggling with this, and everyone else is. You got to go fix it like this, so we can all align on it. that's probably like the opportunity that kind of I can have the highest impact on the core eng side.
At your level, that is the job, but it's not an easy one. And so, are you basically saying, well, Jack Dorsey can do this, and so can Elon, so I can also do this while shipping a phone?
I'm not like, there is an amazing engineer that is head of engineering on mobile that's been like one of my close friends for like also over a decade, that he built like Blackberries, iPhones, like every phone under the sun. And there's an amazing general manager, and between the two of them, they run the show. I kind of set the vision that it's possible to build a like, I don't think people fully grasp the vision of this, but if you look at like Android or iOS, it's a cryptographically signed firmware spec that defines the entire platform. Like, everyone has this device and has effectively trusted boot on it. And when you get a firmware update, it validates that the firmware was signed correctly and rewrites your entire phone. That cryptographic signature is the key part, because that could be generated by a DAO that signs off on.
Jack Dorsey can do this, and so can Elon, so I can also do this while shipping a phone.
I'm not like, there is an amazing engineer that is head of engineering on mobile that's been like one of my close friends for like also over a decade, that he built like Blackberries, iPhones, like every phone under the sun. And there's an amazing general manager, and between the two of them, they run the show. I kind of set the vision that it's possible to build a like, I don't think people fully grasp the vision of this, but if you look at like Android or iOS, it's a cryptographically signed firmware spec that defines the entire platform. Like, everyone has this device and has effectively trusted boot on it. And when you get a firmware update, it validates that the firmware was signed correctly and rewrites your entire phone. That cryptographic signature is the key part, because that could be generated by a DAO that signs off on the entire firmware for Apple. Like, imagine if Apple itself was controlled the cryptographically signed certificate run by a DAO. Right? It like flips the entire kind of like idea of software platforms on its head. That's like the really, really cool, weird kind of hack there. There's not, besides setting that vision and kind of like, you know, whipping the team, sell more phones so that DAO is meaningful, and then like get to that final milestone where the entire ecosystem controls their own firmware. I'm not like in the day-to-day grind of kind of execution. So like Elon, like the way I think Elon works is that he has a big idea, and then he finds an engineer that credibly tells him that he, you know, that engineer can go and build the whole thing, start to finish. If you can find that person, like for your big idea, then the only thing that you need is capital to go accelerate that person. They will go, given infinite amount of time, they will themselves build the entire thing. You give them money, they hire people to accelerate themselves, right? That's it. That's how like I try to operate. I don't know if that's how Elon operates, but this is how I think you can kind of like work on multiple things. Is you have a big idea, very concrete vision, and then you have somebody that's like credibly, yeah, I can build every piece. Give an infinite amount of time, then you give them money and they accelerate themselves.
You say the vision is concrete, but it seems like the ideal outcome is, let's say you succeed and you sell a lot of these phones and it actually breaks through crypto, Twitter. Apple then just reduces their fees. And so basically what you've done is...
We changed the world. Midwest software companies are not paying Apple a ransom. 30% more productive software, more games gets built. That's great.
But that's an altruistic endeavor as opposed to a business endeavor, right? Because
it can only
then you're gonna run a business.
succeed as an altruistic endeavor if it's also successful as a business. Because for Apple to change their fees, they have to see competitive pressure from a growing ecosystem that is commercially viable. Otherwise, they'll just write it out until that ecosystem dies because it's not commercially viable. So it has to find its product market fit and be self-sustaining and stuff like that. But that doesn't mean it won't change the world, right? It'll take a smaller cut. That's the whole point of capitalism, is you see somebody rent seeker with 30% fee and you sell it for 15%. You've now changed the market economics, and now everyone is better off. All the consumers are better off, right? So,
and so you must think you can actually compete with them then, in that sense. The two largest companies on earth, really, Google and Apple, in some cases. What makes you think you can compete with them?
well, it's obvious. It's obvious that 30% fee is too much, because you have Tim Sweeney suing them everywhere he can, and it's a problem for the businesses that use Apple and Google as a distribution channel. So Apple and Google have this rent-seeking fees. Consumers don't care about these fees because they're hidden from them. The consumer pays X amount to the app, and Apple takes 30%. How do we break that problem is the challenge, and this is a network creation problem, which I think crypto has an advantage in, because it has this way to financialize digital assets and scarcity that is different from Web 2. Now again, it might not work, it could fail, and the reason it's going to fail is not because app developers won't lower fees. That's obvious. That's clearly true. It fails because we haven't figured out how to grow the network with the incentives that crypto provides. That's the real hard problem here. It's not a product problem or a business model problem. It is literally, how do we actually force user behavior and have them switch networks.
I'm going to shift gears. I actually want to talk about ZK. One end vision of blockchains seems to be where everything is kind of just ZK powered, and you don't need to execute all these things on the full node. All you can do is just verify proofs. Doesn't seem like Solana really has any plans for this. First of all, is that an accurate assessment?
If you looked at my asynchronous, I wrote an article on how Ape is going to change validators. You can actually have validators that share a common prover to validate state. So you can have a bunch of validators or use a TE or some other trust model or a ZK one, and once an epoch, it rolls up the entire asynchronous execution and computes the whole snapshot hash. So there isn't that idea that fully ZK verifiable rollups are, one, that you need a rollup, and two, that they're not somehow not compatible with Solana. That's silly. You can asynchronous execution allows you to compute that snapshot hash, whatever trust model you want to use, run your own full node, share a TE environment, share a prover environment. I don't really care, because